English translation 493rd contact. Saturday, 17th April 2010, 15:25.
Someone was at the door a moment ago knocking and calling for you when I came into your study.
There was no one outside, and I did not see anyone either on the way in. Besides, people knew that we were doing our proofreading today. Greetings, Ptaah. To greet each other face to face like this is a little more binding than if we do it only through our thoughts.
Which has its correctness, which is also why I send you my greetings.
With your permission, I would like to begin our conversation by asking you a few questions, which I would like you to answer.
There is nothing to prevent that.
Good, thanks. Quetzal and you and I have talked several times in the last 22 years about the fact that Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay were not the first human beings to reach the summit of Mount Everest. After all, these two turned back on the 29th of May 1953, shortly before reaching their destination. But then they claimed against all truth that they had been on the highest point of the mountain. It was not until 1956, on the 23rd and 24th of May, that the summit of Mount Everest was actually reached by two Swiss rope teams. But the first ascent was made by an Englishman in the 1920s, as you explained to me. Unfortunately, you never gave the name of this man. Several times we looked for it in the contact reports, but we could not find any information regarding the name of the Englishman.
We actually did not mention the name of the first conqueror of Mount Everest in any conversation, but you could have asked me for it. But to answer your question, this is what I have to say. The first Earth humans to reach the summit of Mount Everest was a man called Sandy, but he was named Andrew Irvine. He was joined by his rope partner, George Mallory, who climbed the summit of Mount Everest, together with Irvine, on the first ascent in 1924. On the descent, however, both fell and died.
Then for once this is settled. Then I have a perhaps somewhat strange question about the extent to which human beings can communicate with animals at all. I once talked about this with your daughter Simya Se, and she said that human beings, though very rarely, could actually communicate vibrationally.
This is indeed the case, but as my daughter said, it is extremely rare.
There are stories about so-called animal whisperers.
This species is not based on actual communication, but on the fact that human beings can calm and control animals through thought, touch, and words. This animal whispering often occurs, whereby the decisive factor is that the human beings, the animal whisperers, are very well acquainted with the corresponding animals and their natural species, and also have a corresponding empathy for the animals. In the case of what you are talking about, however, that human beings can communicate with animals, the process is that the thought vibrations of human beings are formed in such a way that they are received and understood by animals. These can then actually send out their own instinctive and impulse vibrations to these vibrations in such a way that they are understandable to the human being in question and can be defined as certain statements of the animals, so that the whole thing can be described as a vibrational and impulsive communication. In this way, it is possible for human beings and animals to communicate with and inform with one another. Human beings with these abilities are extremely rare, but they do exist.
And when such human beings come forward with their ability, they are ridiculed and labeled as frauds and charlatans.
Unfortunately, this is actually the case with Earth humans.
Unfortunately. But my next question, which refers to the sea beaches. How is it actually happening with the big ice melting of the poles and the glaciers? Is that already causing the oceans to rise and the beaches to slowly disappear?
That is indeed the case, but for the time being only on a small scale, so the waters of the oceans are only rising by a few centimeters a year, at least for the time being. But the longer the more the ice masses of the Arctic and Antarctic, as well as the other northern ice sheets and the glaciers worldwide, are melting. This in turn leads to very bad consequences for nature, climate, and wild water masses. These destroy human residential areas as well as fertile land needed for food production. What is very bad, however, in relation to the disappearance of the sea beaches you mentioned, is the fact that the Earth humans are overexploiting the sandy beaches of the seas. This is happening in such a way that the sandy beaches of the countries bordering the sea are being exploited in enormous quantities in order to build houses and other buildings, etc. Many sandy beaches have already disappeared in various countries bordering the sea. And in order to stop the rolling waves, which can no longer run out due to the lack of sandy beaches, the waters have been and are slowed down by unsightly large boulder walls so that they cannot roll into the land. Today, many houses and buildings that were once built in front of the beaches stand close to the boulder walls, where the seawater rolls up and foams up. Because of the lack of sandy beaches, beach tourism, which was and is the only source of income for countless Earth humans, is also disappearing in various countries. Tourist destinations such as Greece and Florida have already been particularly severely affected by this.
Even in my time, when I was still traveling in foreign countries, I saw how masses of sand were mined from the ocean beaches to make pavements and building materials for building houses and so on. In the meantime, however, this has increased enormously and become more and more prevalent as a result of the fact that fewer and fewer sandpits are found on the mainland. Or not at all, as is also becoming increasingly precarious with gravel pits, with the result that streams, rivers, and lakes are dredged for construction gravel. The nature is enormously disfigured and damaged by the human beings of the earth. In fact, it no longer has any possibility to regenerate itself. And all this is only happening through the madness of overpopulation, which is also to blame for the fact that the seas and waters are overfished, and all kinds of animal species and plants are being exterminated, and enormous natural disasters are being caused. And this the more the overpopulation is growing, which in 1900 was 1.6 billion, 1,600,000. But today it is 7.8 billion, 7,800,000. Neither those responsible for government nor the majority of the Earth's population want to admit that the increasing occurrence of climate madness and volcanic eruptions, which are now causing worldwide problems for the whole of humanity, is also caused by overpopulation and its constant growth. And all those who consider themselves to be super cunning invent all kinds of nonsensical claims that overpopulation is not to blame for climate change and today's natural disasters, and so on. Cunning wannabes even claim that population growth will automatically decrease again, and that everything will get back to normal without human beings having to take any special measures. They idiotically claim that rapid growth is not the real problem, and that it will anyway fall off again after another generation and settle down. So the threat to earthly humanity is not the immense number of the rising world population, but the increasing consumption caused by human beings. But what damage is caused by this increasing consumption due to the growing overpopulation in terms of the entire nature and its fauna and flora? The planet itself, the atmosphere as well as the climate, not a word is said about it. The odd know-it-all might say something about the fact that the growing world population is also producing more CO2, but what is actually being done in general terms to cause totally catastrophic damage to nature, to all life, to and within the planet, to the atmosphere and other spheres, to the seas and other bodies of water, and to the climate itself, is not said at all. It is not considered in any way that the horrendous growth of Earth humans is causing more and more destruction to the climate and to all nature, forcing them to fight back. These destructions of nature and climate also include the overexploitation of the rainforests, the idiotic exploitation of the groundwater reserves, rivers, streams, and lakes in order to be able to use water for food plantations, the products of which are then sold at a high price. The destruction also includes all the roads, airports, residential and factory buildings, etc., that are built on meadows and farmland and destroy fertile soil. Destruction of nature is also caused by agriculture and gardening companies, which spread enormous amounts of chemicals and compact the fertile soil with heavy vehicles and equipment in such a way that it can no longer absorb rainwater, causing flooding. Only the first few centimeters of the soil can still absorb moisture, but this dries out again immediately when the sun shines or the wind blows. The exploitation of petroleum and natural gas is also part of this scenario of destruction, along with many other things and factors that can hardly be enumerated everywhere, and which are attributed to the overpopulation. But everything will be much worse in the future than it is now, just as I have described in various predictions. Some super smart people are also talking about it nowadays, but only now, when my predictions are completely true and the whole thing cannot be reversed. Now only the very worst can be prevented, when the earthly mankind spurs on and returns on its path of destruction. But this means that all the pseudo-scientific assertions, rules and decisions of the would-be scientists, the rulers and the climate conferees must be replaced by effective and appropriate deeds and actions. And here the main concern must be that worldwide birth control is introduced as quickly as possible, thereby bringing about a radical but humane reduction in births. And this must necessarily be such that the number of human beings dying naturally is much higher than the permitted births. If this is not handled in this way, then the great catastrophe is unstoppable. The whole thing has to be handled radically, so that the same cannot happen as in China, where the one-child family is supposed to be the rule. But this is only a theory, because exceptions are made, and quite a lot of them, and consequently only about 36% of the population is affected by the one-child family. And what is the hammer when it comes to witnessing offspring is the fact that in various countries the economy and governments are making intensive efforts to encourage parents, and it is really no longer comprehensible, and even single human beings to father children by paying them birth premiums and tax reductions, and by paying out exorbitant child allowances.
We have talked about this many times, and you yourself have written a lot about it since the 1950s and made predictions, which you have sent to the governments of the earth and to well-known newspapers, journals, and organizations. But you were only laughed at or completely ignored.
But today, scientists and governments are talking big words about restoring nature's rights and countering global warming and its effects. But their behavior is ridiculous, and their words are only big and loud, without being able to find and implement the correct solutions, precisely the containment of overpopulation, in which all the blame lies with all the natural disasters and other evils of our time. But still nobody wants to recognize this, let alone admit it.
Which unfortunately will not change quickly.
Sadly, it is therefore that only nobodies continue to speak out, but they do nothing to stop the evil. Those responsible will continue to spit out big words at climate conferences and make feeble-minded decisions that do not contribute a single iota to really end the existing evils, or at least to contain them. So there is really no point in talking about it, which is why I want to move on to another subject, namely the sexual abuse and mistreatment of children by pedophiles and other child abusers. But I also want to take into account women who are abused and raped. We have often talked about this in private, and you have also said that sexual and psychological as well as physical rape of women, children, and young people causes lifelong psychological and conscious damage in those affected. This is actually known to our psychologists and psychiatrists, etc. But you said that these lifelong damages are not the end of the evil. You should say something about this in a short form for our conversation reports. A short and concise statement is enough.
Sexual, physical, and psychological rape Abuse and mistreatment of women and men, as well as of male and female children and adolescents, not only result in lifelong damage to the psyche and the consciousness, and thus also to thoughts and feelings, but also have a general effect. The evil experiences and adventures are not only stored in the memory and subconscious, but also in the genes, and consequently the evil is reflected as a hereditary factor in the offspring. As a result, both female and male descendants then suffer, precisely through a genetic predisposition, from psychological and consciousness impairments, which are expressed in various forms of fears, etc., with regard to sexual, physical, and psychological factors, as well as in dealing with other human beings.
Thank you. That is enough and understandable. Then I have the following question. What is the situation regarding super senses, how they are basically called? Is it possible with such senses that super tasters can feel a taste, or super smellers can feel or taste colors, as well as super visionaries can see in the dark, etc.? I only want to know whether this is possible or not, so you can save yourself an explanation.
That is indeed the case.
But while we are on the subject of genes, I would like to say something that your father Svath explained to me when I was a teenager, so that it is also recorded in a conversation report. So it is to be said that through the genes, the normal creational natural urges have an effect on human beings. Also the urge to love, according to which human beings have the need for love. But these creational natural urges also convey other values, such as goodness, compassion, peace and harmony, etc., which human beings must, however, work on and bring to bear according to their own will. Unfortunately, it is the case today that human beings often misperceive the urge to love and associate it with material things, such as appearance, reputation, image, profession, money, respectively possessions, property, possessions, skills, and false body odors through chemical hygiene products. The social position and the sexual drive, as well as other things, are also of importance. All these factors often play a very important role today, according to which a so-called love relationship is decided upon. However, this relationship is not based on true sentimental love, but only on a mental emotional love, and therefore also very often on an imaginary delusional love. These factors are also the reasons why human beings are all too often bound together in marriages and other relationships that are doomed to failure from the very beginning, so that sooner or later they will get divorced again and separate. The true urge to love has nothing to do with the sex drive, because this is of a completely different nature, is shaped by instinct, and is not related to a reproductive urge, as is mistakenly assumed. It is probably true that a large percentage of human behavior is determined by genes, but it is not a compulsion that is in the foreground, but only a creative natural urge. But how this urge is used by human beings in terms of their behavior and its effects is a matter of their own choice, which they shape themselves through their ideas, thoughts, and feelings. And with regard to these creational natural urges, which are predetermined in a natural and general way, and in a variety of ways, it must again be said that, with regard to their development, application, and effects, these urges fall exclusively within the sphere of human beings' own decision. This is contrary to all the factors given regularly, which appear as instincts and have nothing to do with the creative natural urges which are given so that human beings are good and not evil. In principle, every human being is born as a neutral, balanced life form so that it is not fundamentally good or evil, for good and evil are created only through education and through the influences of the environment. And this is also the case when there are generally unpleasant factors, because only by giving space to these impulses and living them out can they become effective. So, if human beings are not impressed by wrong educational measures and wrong environmental influences, and if they avoid evil from the bottom up, then the bad gene storage has not a chance to become effective. This, however, requires that the education in all forms is correct and corresponds to correctness, accuracy, and righteousness. But these are all facts which I have been teaching for decades, and which I have been spreading worldwide. However, only a few reasonable people recognize the correctness of my words as truth and act accordingly differently and more reasonably. But what brings better success in this respect is related to what I teach according to the teachings of the prophets, respectively. The teachings of truth, teachings of the Spirit, teachings of life, because in this respect there are always pleasant successes. Human beings, men and women of all ages, who are studying the teaching, take the teaching into themselves and try to understand it in the best possible way, whereby their lives, as well as their way of life, and their relationship with their relatives and fellow men in general, change for the better. Also, with regard to the understanding of the creational natural laws and recommendations, more and more success is becoming apparent among those human beings who turn to the teaching. The understanding of nature and its fauna and flora, as well as of world events, is also becoming more and more apparent to the students. And again I experience that the interest in the teaching is constantly increasing, and that new successes are also being achieved in the sense that the students are becoming more and more familiar with reality and its truth, and are beginning to live with it. This, while they free themselves from religious or sectarian delusions of God, become free from fear and begin to think and decide independently and take responsibility for everything and anything in their lives.
Nothing more is to be said about this. But if you now have no more questions, then we should turn to the things that we are accustomed to discussing only in private.
Naturally. Actually, I do not have any more questions.